Welcome to Retail Retold, the stories behind how that store landed in your neighborhood. I'm Chris Ressa, in conversation with the people and stories shaping retail and real estate. Brought to you by DLC.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to What's in Store with Karly and Chris, the show where we cover hot topics at the cross section of retail and real estate. I'm Karly Iacono, and I'm joined by my co host, Chris Ressa. Chris, amazing to see you. How are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Living life, doing great, no complaints. So, we have a really fantastic sort of summer recap for all of our listeners today. We're going to cover an update on the Bed Bath & Beyond lease auction bankruptcy. We're going to cover some new information on DTC and store-in-store concepts. So, we got a lot of good information, and we're happy everyone listening could join us today.
Well, speaking of summer recaps, I saw you were bungee jumping off of skyscrapers. What was that all about?
I mean, sort of,
Okay.
almost. I did this crazy experience called City Climb at Hudson Yards in Manhattan. It is
Okay.
the tallest open air building ascent in the world. So, how it works, you go, you get all harnessed up, hard hat, safety briefing. They give you a breathalyzer. Like, it is no joke. All these questionnaires. And then you climb up the outside of Hudson Yards and hang over at 1,200 feet in the air off of this like see-through platform. Just hang over the edge of the building, and then you go back down. It was maybe insane, but so much fun. Highly recommend it.
When you say go back down, are you going back down like scaling the side of the building?
I wish they wouldn't let
Okay.
me do that, to be honest. I was like,
Okay.
I really felt like that was a missed opportunity, but no. You go back down a few stairs, they take you out of all your safety gear and whisk you down the high-speed elevator. So that part is very unexciting.
Okay. Got it.
But they
Was
also do
it
it at night, so if you wanna go back, I'll go anyone listening, you wanna go back, we'll do a real estate trip. It
was
was
it
great.
scarier going up or down?
It was definitely scary going up because it was really, really windy. Views are incredible, but there's just nothing around you. And that is very, very high, insanely high, right at
That's
the
really
very
high.
top of the city. Nothing else even close to the same elevation when you're up there. It's amazing.
Wow.
So good times, good times. That's how I, kicked off my 4th of July, which was great.
Got it. Well, cool. Good for you.
And I hope you are finding summer adventure as well. Good time with the family at the beach. Anything exciting planned in your world?
Nothing like jumping off a building. So
All right. Next month. You can come recap with us next month. You'll find something.
perfect.
All right, let's jump into Bed Bath and Beyond, and really not just Bed Bath and Beyond, but the overall benefits of retail bankruptcies. And we've touched on this in a few different episodes, but I'd love to kind of look at it from the landlord perspective, other retailers' perspective, and of course, lenders as well. So, why don't we start with the landlord? When you hear bankruptcy, the first thing, obviously, first reaction is, but not in today's market. So, being a landlord, what is your feeling on having a vacancy or a retail bankruptcy in one of your centers?
Well, I think it all depends. The reality is there are some bankruptcies that are painful for the landlord, but there's some that are opportunities, right? I think when we go back in time to like the whole Sears Kmart, I think if we look today and we looked at all the Kmart, vacant Kmarts that were, and then, so many are leased today, I think we would say that the landlord community has brought such a more vibrant, well-trafficked retail offering to the market. So many of those are like, we're split up into multiple things like call it a TJ Maxx, a Ross, a Five Below, an Ulta, and maybe a Chipotle with a, Chipotlane on the end. And that creates more economic output for the entire trade area. It created jobs. It made a more vibrant, trafficked, community gathering place. So I think in general, right, in that scenario, that was like such long waited, like everyone was like waiting for this to happen. And At the time, in some properties, you would probably say, what would you rather have, that retailer hanging on, Kmart hanging on, or would you like the opportunity to actually, re-tenant that box? There's always a scenario where, the tenant leaving might be above market rent. And if they leave, you're not going to be able to replace the rent. But I think in today's market, we saw with the Bed Bath, there's a lot of opportunities for landlords to get the space back earlier than they thought and either get a higher rent or maybe unlock a redevelopment or something even bigger.
So, what this is telling me is it's really a chance to re examine the center, breathe new life in. Like you said, it almost reminds me of term limits on politicians, right? After so many years, sometimes it's just time for a change and you need new energy in politics or in your shopping center. But the key here is exactly what you said, Chris. It's how your rent that you're replacing compares to market. If it's a really old lease, could be a huge opportunity. If it was a really expensive build out for the tenant and in turn they gave you high rent and now you're stuck with above market rent, then it could be more of a challenge to replace that and maintain the NOI in the center. But I think overall, with vacancy levels as low as they are and a lot of legacy retailers that are turning over, it seems to be a net positive for landlords. And I think you would agree, no?
I think so. And I think the reality is the time that it really impacts the macro landscape of retail real estate is when there's a significant amount all at once.
Right.
So back in 08, 09, and you had like Circuit, Linens, and all these groups going and closing so many stores. But the world has changed a bit. So I, I'm a landlord of two Bed Bath and Beyond stores, but in uh I don't know, as recent as 2015, 16, I had double digit Bed Baths. And so I think one of the things that's happened that is more frequent today than in yesteryear is some of these retailers, when they start to get in trouble, they start pruning some of the stores out. And so I would argue that a lot of the Bed Bath and Beyonds already have former Bed Baths already have new tenants in them before Bed Bath even filed. They at one time they had, so many stores. I think the amount of stores for sale at the bankruptcy was like 375 leases. I don't know what
Yeah.
I don't know what it was, in 2009, but I think they had a lot more stores. So even if a couple of retailers file, there's still it's probably the last straw, and it's still not this significant volume of supply coming to the market that, disrupts the demand that's there today.
And this is looked at as a good thing because of where we are with vacancy in the market too. As we've said in so many episodes, we are at historically low vacancy levels, actually the tightest market since 2005 when CBRE began tracking tenant vacancy.
Yeah,
So,
and
I mean,
I
that
would
plays into, right?
for sure. I would say when we say it's a good thing, I would say there's a bankruptcy in general is not a good thing. People are losing jobs. There's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of legacy and nostalgia in Bed Bath and Beyond. It's a retailer I've loved for years.
Mhm.
I think what we're talking about is there are potential positive outcomes that could come from it.
Right. Very fair. Good distinction. Very important. Agreed.
Yeah.
One side we don't look at as often is what this means for other retailers. So Bed Bath and Beyond had about 7 billion of sales in the last trailing 12 months. So tremendous number. Where is all of that volume going? Consumers aren't just going to stop buying the products that they used to buy at Bed Bath and Beyond. So who's benefiting? And, I think this is something that we don't really talk about. When there is a larger bankruptcy, other tenants do profit from this. So where do you see that market share being picked up?
You know, it's a question I've been asking and I haven't seen a lot of headline news about. And I think, I'm often taken back to Toys R Us. Toys R Us was, you know, when they filed, they were like number 265 on Fortune 500. It was pretty wild. They were really up there. and and they had like 13 billion in retail sales. And so I was like, okay, they're gone. Like kids still want toys. At least mine do.
Right.
Where is this
Right.
toy business going? And we saw, I don't think there's like a clear answer even to that, but we saw Target and Walmart and Amazon pick up all these toy sales. And so I think, and if you go into like Target, like the toy section at Target is huge. Like, I know because 'cause I'm there, it's pretty big. Like, any type of toys you want your kids want, they've got a lot of different variety and depth of selection, which I'm not sure they had pre-Toys R Us, maybe they did, but it's pretty wild. So I think you saw some of that. So I think my point is, I think some of the mass merchants are really good at picking up share
Right.
um, as a global cohort. So you'll see that. But I'm fascinated, like, the Container Store Dormify partnership to me is really cool. Dormify is a cool story. This young woman and her mother couldn't really, get the dorm when she was going to college set up how she wanted. There was no retail offering. They created an online business called Dormify, and Container Store just partnered with them. And there's going to be dormifies inside the Container Store, which I think is really interesting because Bed Bath& and Beyond had they had a lot of niche businesses in this big business. They were really good at bridal registry. They were really good at baby registry. They were really good at back to school for college and setting up the dorm. They had a real big focus on this. I don't know who's capturing that, but the Container Store's gone right after it. I think it's fascinating. And, kudos to them. And we'll see who else starts to try to pick up some stuff.
Think Target does that right back to college, but Bed Bath& and Beyond had such a unique presence when you went in the store, right? Their actual setup, you felt like you were there, you could pick all the pieces. So I'm wondering if some of the other mass merchandisers will try to capture, maybe that's exactly what Container Store is doing with Dormify, capture that feeling when you go in that you see the whole room put together and it's not just ordering individual products one off like you might do on Amazon. So
Yeah.
that could be an opportunity.
And
Um,
then,
Seems
and,
like
and
they're
on an
focused on.
And then on an individual store perspective, like we saw this with J.C. Penney and Kohl's, where like in an individual market where maybe there's like a J.C. Penney and Kohl's, and that was like the two dominant apparel retailers. When J.C. Penney left that market, Kohl's did see a pickup in that specific trade area.
Mm.
And they probably didn't capture it all, but they captured a bunch. So I think in some areas you're gonna, the the market share is gonna get dispersed depending on who's in that local trade area.
Right. It's gonna be more regional
Yeah.
conversation. The last thing I want to touch on before we move on to more details on the Bed Bath lease auction is how lenders are viewing bankruptcies in today's market. So we're seeing a lot of loan covenants tighten up. Obviously, lending standards have changed tremendously in the last 6 months. Have you had any issues or have you seen anything in the market where there's a vacancy in a center and the lender says we're no longer comfortable with this loan, right? Maybe the coverage ratios aren't there and we're calling the loan, or what is the lender perspective on retailer bankruptcies that you're seeing?
I I don't know that it's any different than it's historically been. Typically, that's all spelled out in the loan docs. It's like what happens to a vacancy. So I'm not going to say that lenders aren't concerned about retailers going bankrupt, but they've typically hedged and mitigated themselves on the front side of the loan docs in the event of large vacancies happening.
Okay, that's good to hear. So you don't think there would be less workouts or more workouts because lenders don't want properties back given the challenge in the capital markets. It's more just spelled out in the loan documents and then discussed or negotiated, let's say, on an individual basis.
I think it's, the impacts to the capital markets are so robust that no one bankruptcy is like, making market changes to what's happening.
Okay. All right. Good to hear. Let's move on to your experience with the Bed Bath& and Beyond lease auction, which is fascinating to me. So, from what I was seeing, there were about 153 leases that just went up for auction, and I think about 109 traded, right?
Yeah. So they, what happens was what happened was before the first auction was on a Monday, and the Thursday before you had to submit what they called a qualified bid. On Saturday, if you qualified, you could show up to the auction on Monday. And then
Okay.
that bid would stand if they wanted. Once you submitted a bid, you're locked in at that minimum that would stand if there were no other bidders and they said, yes, we're going to take this. Um, Go ahead.
So who was there bidding, right? Were you in person? Did you mail in your bid personally? And then who else was around you? Other landlords, tenants? Give me an overview of the landscape.
So on Saturday, you didn't know who was there. And then on Monday, you showed up. You had to have like whoever was going, they had to say they were going and you had to be on a list. You had to be someone who had a qualified bid. You had to be on a list. Then you walk through the doors. And the landscape was a variety. It was landlords and other growing retailers who wanted to be there. I think those were the two biggest food groups at the lease auction.
Okay.
And yeah, and there was 4 phases of bidding. So there was the first set of leases was leases that they received only bids from landlords. The second phase of leases were bids they received only from retailers, and the third phase was uh, competitive multiple bids for one lease, and then the fourth phase was the package deal that Burlington made.
So I'm going to just break this down on a more elementary level for some of our listeners who aren't in this space day to day. And correct me if I'm off on any part of this, Chris. But the auction is for the lease. And this has nothing to do with the real estate, nothing to do with the assets. This is just for the right to take over the remaining lease terms as they stand. Right. So if there's 8 years left in term and you really want that location and you're a competing retailer, you can come pay a premium to take over the remaining lease with all in place terms and kind of slide into the position. Correct?
Yeah, generally speaking, I would say that's correct. I'm not sure every piece of the legal way you said it was right, but generally speaking, from the
Conceptually, business wise.
yes,
Right, right. So the fact that retailers are paying just to take over a lease instead of going to sign their own new lease somewhere else really also points to the tightness in some of these markets where these transactions went down. I think it's amazing. They would pay such a premium.
yeah, I was pretty shocked by some of the premiums that were paid for some of the leases. Um, in some of the places, I was kind of sitting there going, saying to my colleague next to me, I was like, "We have to go and see if we can buy that center. I can't believe all these
Right.
retailers are like competitively bidding
Fighting.
on a vacant space to be in the center. Is there
Right.
no other shopping centers in the market? Is there just no
Exactly my point.
vacancy? What's going on?"
Right. I read that was it Macy's paid 1.2 million to take over a lease in Winter Park, Florida. That blew me
Yeah,
away. It's
yeah.
crazy.
So that I was watching that as it went down.
Wow.
That you know, and Macy's had a team there, and like they were pretty sophisticated on how they were doing their bidding, and
Right.
they were going back and forth with Michaels on that one, and it ended up it was like in 25,000 increments from 100 grand up. They went all the way up to 1.2.
Wow. That had to be
So
exciting.
yeah, it was really wild to watch.
Amazing. And what other retailers did you see competitive while you were there? Who else got
So
really
so
excited?
so Burlington was there, Macy's, Michaels, Barnes,
Okay.
Haverty's was there, Ollie's was there, Scandinavian Design. There's a significant amount of different retailers. Scandinavian Design, PJ Superstore was there, Scandinavian Design and Haverty's. Raymore Flanagan was there. That kind of made sense for me because the Bed Bath home use provision probably made sense. I think, and that's another thing which I think is really telling. So for 153 bids, I think, some might think about, that's less than 50% of the stores got bid on. Well, there's a couple of things. One, there are a lot of other stores where the retailer has decided their best path isn't to buy the lease in bankruptcy court, is to try to let that lease go back to the landlord and make a direct deal with the landlord
Okay.
instead of taking over someone else's lease. We have a center with 5 LOIs with a Bed Bath, and no one bid on that lease.
Hmm.
But here's
Okay.
why. But here's why. Because you're buying an asset. So the first thing that the lease needs to have is term.
Right.
So my lease has 1 year of term, 1 5-year option. If very few leases are trading sub 10 years of term, right? That's the asset that the bankruptcy court is selling, right? That the debtors are selling is I have this right to this space for a period of time. So if you think about that on the space that I have, which has 1 year term, 1 5-year option, if a landlord, if a retailer bought that and then in 6 years, they spent all the money to turn it into whatever their store was, they're finally starting to grow sales. And in 6 years, they had no options. I could just terminate them and get someone else in. So the first thing they need is term. So there was a lot of the amount of leases that were what I called sub $10 a foot and sub and more than 10 years of term was give or take a little north of 100. So I think, when you're thinking about this in the market, like I would say that almost every like market lease with 10 years of term it felt like it almost got a bid. Now, that's obviously an aggressive statement, but the point is, there was a lot of, Bed Bath and Beyonds over the last few years where they were renewing a lease with a landlord and maybe it was a kick the can down the road, like a 2 year extension. Right. And so just, we're not sure how we're doing. If you want me to renew for 10 years, I'm going to close. So they make a deal for 2 years, something like that. And the landlord and retailer are kicking the can down the road. So that lease being sold, there's not a lot of buyers.
Right. Because there's not a lot of long-term value. And what do
Yeah.
the options look like on a lot of these? I mean, let's say there is the 2-year term, but maybe there's 15 years of options.
Yeah,
That's a
they're
different
all over the
story.
board. You could go to like
Okay.
A&G's website and look at every lease that was for sale.
Okay.
And it has the rent, the term, the location, the options. But the other thing, right, that I was mentioning is the use restrictions in a shopping center. So if the tenant's lease says, if Bed Bath and Beyond's lease said you have to use the premises for XYZ, well, that's what you were buying. If you were some use that couldn't use it for what was in Bed Bath's lease, if they didn't have the catch-all language that said for any retail purpose, well, then that's a tough putt for you to buy that lease. You're
I
better
would
off waiting for that lease to go back to the landlord and making a direct deal.
I would hope you would know all that on the front end if you were bidding, right? I'm sure all that documentation was shared.
Uh, there's
I
a
would
lot
hope.
of yeah, there's a lot of stuff, and then
Okay.
yeah,
Because restrictions are, I
yeah,
mean, that would change the whole nature
exactly,
of the deal. Yeah,
right.
very, very interesting. What's your prediction for the leases that they brought to auction, so they thought there was enough value to go that route, but they didn't trade? Is there going to be a round 2 here?
Yeah, I think round 2 is next week.
Okay,
Yeah,
interesting. So give it another go for that subset, and then the
that's
ones
for
that were
sure.
not brought to auction, do we think that these will be brought at a later date, or the terms are just too short, or just doesn't make sense?
I'm not sure what the plan is for those.
Okay.
Yeah,
Overall, very interesting
yeah,
experience and
it was a
strategy
cool experience. It was a cool experience to see how it was all going down, for sure.
in person. Do you think you'd go in person to another bankruptcy auction if given the opportunity?
Yeah, I think you have to be bidding. I don't think they just let anyone in the room. At least
Mhm.
this one they didn't. And
Right,
then if they have the option to make it virtual or in person, unless you're like, all right, I'm going to submit a bid for like 50 cents. And if they take it, great. If not, I don't care. If
right.
you're like really planning on competitive bidding, I would recommend that you go. There's a lot to be seen in the room. And those who were virtual didn't get to see all that. So I think there's probably opportunity from being physically present.
I love when you told me there were teams for some of these large retailers with computers running, their laptops with them, running different
Oh,
models as the
yeah.
bids changed and kind of huddled
Yeah.
together. And it sounds like a scene from a movie. So
Yeah. It was pretty
really,
cool.
really cool. All right, let's move on to what's happening in the DTC world, direct to consumer. So there's been just a few things we want to touch on. One, what the growth looks like and how physical retail is playing in, and then what segments of DTC have really surprised us and not been covered as much in the media for the pretty impressive growth. So I'll kick it off with a stat that we both shared from KPMG, which estimates compound annual growth of 23% from 2019 to 2023 in direct to consumer sales. So, compound annual growth of 23%. That's the phenomenal, right? Astronomical numbers of the success of DTC brands. So, what does that mean for us in physical retail? Direct to consumer used to be very often, right? Just online only. That's no longer the case. So, how are you seeing the growth of DTC impact bricks and mortar?
Yeah, I think direct to consumer has significantly grown. And I think most of them reach a point where they say, oh, we need physical stores too. And we've seen that from so many, and we still continue to see that. I think how people enter stores is different across the board, right? Like some might have a store in store, like Dormify. Some might have a pop up. Some might be Warby and, just open up normal physical stores. What I think is interesting with this explosion to me is we haven't seen a lot of this get into what I would consider the traditional open air suburban retail center, which is the majority of centers in America. And I think given a change in the workplace, meaning there's hybrid and people are home more, and this move where people have moved out of cities into many places in America, I think you're going to start to see more and more like, you know, some lifestyle brand in a traditional grocery anchored center. That hasn't happened in scale yet, but stay tuned. I think that's going to happen.
It could be fun to watch a trajectory from the store in store, the pop up, or these just almost feels like testing, like dipping their toe in
Yeah.
concepts. How many of those in 5 years were like, oh, of course it's in every, it's right next to the Starbucks in every suburban shopping center. Like, how is that? Oh, not always been the case, right? Becomes so commonplace. So that'll
Yeah,
be a fun sort of growth pattern to watch.
for
Now,
sure.
there's one category when we were catching up that you mentioned, which blew my mind, and I'm gonna let you cover it because you brought it
Yeah.
up, but here's yeah, go ahead.
So the jewelry has just been fascinating. I had no idea there was so many new jewelers who were doing so well online and then opening physical stores. And then, the net new number of physical jewelry stores is 100 and what is it, Carly? I don't have it in front of me.
I think it was a net increase of 133, which was 70% increase 2019 to 2023.
Yeah, which is just so people want to feel good about themselves. They're buying jewelry. And I think it's a fascinating category that, doesn't get spoken about as much in retail because it's usually smaller spaces, specialty. Um, but the fact that there's like just about every category that went online and tried to do DTC through online is now going into other avenues, which might be physical stores, might be some wholesale, might be store and store. I think it's really, made retail real estate stronger in the long haul, created more opportunities for new tenants that were never there.
And some of these numbers really are a surprise, the growth numbers. You think, oh, maybe there's a local jeweler who opens a small store, but these are big brands that are betting heavily on bricks and mortar. And I think that's really the takeaway. Everything from Tiffany's, Kendra Scott, Blue Nile, like a wide range of pretty significant tenants are saying, we're changing our strategy and we need to be in these centers in some capacity.
Yeah, it's
Really,
pretty
really
exciting.
interesting. Yeah, for sure. Last thing we're going to touch on today is an update on store in store. And we've kind of, skirted around this already, but what are you seeing be really successful and where do you think we go from here in store to store concept?
I I think there's clearly some, store and store is clearly here to stay. I think it's an ancillary part of a lot of these retailers' businesses, but it's certainly super interesting. The numbers Kohl's is talking about, which by the way, Kohl's, what unbelievable execution they've had, right? They announced this partnership with Sephora
Sephora.
in
Yep.
2020, and they've rolled out 850. That execution is
So
pretty,
fast.
because it's
Yeah.
in their stores, it's disrupting their stores, and the increase in the sales they've had and the year-over-year growth and the amount of new customers they have and the amount of new beauty segments that they've been, you know, able to get into the store has been really uncanny. If you just go to Kohl's earnings, and it talks about all these new things that have happened because of this. And it's been so strong that now Kohl's is opening another couple hundred in stores that weren't originally identified for Sephora. So I think that's really interesting for both concepts, Sephora and Kohl's.
One thing I'd like to point out on that, I think they did exceptionally well with the branding of Sephora. So I've seen store in store, let's say when Toys R Us opens up in Macy's. I don't think their in-store presence is the same or anything close to what Kohl's has executed. When you go to a Kohl's with a Sephora now, it's noted on the outside of the building. When you walk in, there's a full build out, almost an interior facade. I know that doesn't make sense, but an interior build out that makes it feel like you're walking into a Sephora. So they really put money into almost having a consistent Sephora experience that you forget you're inside of another store. So how retailers roll out store in store and how much money they put into these build outs to affect the consumer experience, I think will make a big difference on the success of these programs.
Yeah, the CapEx was no doubt. I'm sure you can look it up in their earnings, but the CapEx just from the eye test is significant compared to some things that I've seen out there for sure. And I think, if there's a lack of space out there, you might continue to see some new store and store partnerships for people to, really gain some market share that they might not otherwise get.
Exactly. I did also see that Walmart was partnering with Claire's to do store in store. I think they've got about 360 store in store locations. And I'll be interested to see if it feels more like the Sephora Kohl's build out or if it's just a section that happens to have some Claire's branded products. So
Yeah, that's the
that'll
difference
be,
for sure.
yeah, exactly. All right, we covered a lot of great stuff. I'm so glad we could do our summer retail recap today. To everyone listening, I hope you found this information valuable. As always, reach out to Chris or I if you'd like to talk retail real estate. Chris, amazing to see you and looking forward to next month.
You too. Take care, Carla.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Appreciate you watching. Hit subscribe. See you in the next one.